In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up this clock for animation. This assumes that you don't have to be told how to model or texture any of these things, and that you have these ready to proceed with our setup. I have just simply given materials to individual faces, so I use the multi-cut tool to just carve out details on this little man. Not at all a way that you should normally do something, but nice and quick for setup purposes. And forgive my modeling, sometimes it's kind of wasteful and strange, but it's going to work out just fine for this demonstration. So don't worry if something looks pretty odd. You don't have to model the way that I model. If you have your clock all modeled and set up and looking nice, then you're ready to start with our animation setup. Here I have my finished clock with all of the details and materials. Without any hierarchy, we're going to set up this for animation. You can see in the outliner on the left-hand side, all of the different parts. So we have doors, hands for the clock, chain, weights. And by the way, this just goes off to nothing. We don't have to worry about that because our shot will be composed fairly up close. Pendulum, which you can animate swinging back and forth. The overall clock body, and note how much stuff is combined here. Anything that doesn't move, we want to combine into a single object. So that's pretty much all of this. Then we have the little toy man, and he's going to take the most hierarchy because this will be the most animated part of our scene. So he's got arms, hands, a bell, the clapper of the bell because I'd like that to move, his head, and his hat, possibly going to animate that as well. So what are the steps we want to follow when we're setting up objects for animation? And this is a lot simpler than an entire animated rig with bones and skinning, but this is necessary for most of your most common setup for props and environment objects that need to animate, such as doors and treasure chests and things like that. We want to follow a few steps. We want to delete our history, freeze our transformations, check for extra objects in the outliner and delete them, set the center of pivot, name everything, and then save. So that's a lot to go through, but let's very quickly look at a small example here. I'm going to just create a cube, and I'm going to duplicate it a couple of times. Duplicate, duplicate, like this. And I'm going to create a little bit of junk in our outliner by mesh combining. So if I come up here, mesh combine, you can see we get these things in our outliner. These are sort of transform objects, and they're here because of the history on these objects. These objects right now remember that they were individuals before I mesh combined them, and so you can see they take on the same name, but if I open up the hierarchy in here, they've got a little transform node underneath there. So where did my actual polygon object go? Well, it's still here. It just looks different for the moment. And we can cause that to happen again if I mesh combine an additional time. There we go, mesh combined. So we've got these polyunite inputs in our channel box, and we've got these extra objects in our outliner. We want to make sure that we get rid of all that stuff before we start proceeding to any of our further steps in setting up our object. And so it's pretty critical that we freeze transformations and delete history. I'm going to just put some transformations in here as well. We'll say that for some reason we modeled it over here and shrunk it like this. So now we've got a bunch of numbers in our channel box that are other than 0 and 1. Okay. If you don't handle this, then you can get very strange errors in your resulting rigs, things that shear and bend in strange, unpredictable ways. So if you ever have something like that happen, like you rotate something and it's not behaving the way that you expect and you don't know why, it's probably due to this problem. So here's what we do. First, we want to come up to Edit, Delete by Type History. Make a note that there's several different deletes here. Delete will just get rid of the object entirely, and we don't want that. And then we've got All by Type. If you are absolutely sure that in your entire scene, all you have are the same kind of object, like nothing but polygon objects, that you're going to proceed to these steps, then you can delete All by Type history if you want to. But rigging is a very specific, pedantic kind of discipline. So you want to be as careful as you possibly can to only delete what you intend to delete so that you don't cause unforeseen problems. For that reason, I'll almost always go to delete by type history. Okay. So once I do that, the inputs disappear and those proxy objects disappear. And now this is called pcube5 because apparently that was the one that it took its name from when I mesh combined all these different cubes. We still have our non-zeroed transformations. So we want to go to modify, freeze transformations. Now, there is a second option here, reset transformations. This one will reset all of those numbers to their original values, but that moves this back to its original position. So that's usually not what you want, although that can be helpful sometimes. Freeze transformations will say, this is the new default position. Okay, so there we go. The default translates, rotates, and scales. The reason we want that is because if we take a look at our toy, this position for this hat should be considered the default position, zeroed, right? I know it's rotated on his head a little bit, but I probably could center it on top of his head if I wanted to. A better example might even be the clapper, where its rotation is centered as well, although we can see some transformations here that will need to be set, or the default position of this arm. Okay, so once we've frozen those transformations, then we want to check in our outliner, make sure that everything went away. This would be also a good time to give it a name. You can double click slowly in the outliner to select the name, or you can do it right up here in the channel box, which I often do. We'll name this example. Okay. We want to set the center of pivot for this object. It's not obvious on this one where the center of pivot might be. It would be more obvious for something like this bell clapper, which we want to rotate in such a way that it can hit the sides of the bell and not just be rotating from the center of this sphere up here. To change the center of pivot, you want to hit Insert on your keyboard and move the gizmo to the correct position. You can snap this gizmo, by the way, if you need to, by holding down V for vertex and dragging from the center, or C for curve if you have one. If you don't have a curve, it's going to choose edges. X for grid, which usually is not an appropriate option unless you are modeling to the grid. So I'm going to choose V for vertex, snap it to this center vertex, and then just move it down. We could find an exact location by snapping only a single dimension at a time. So I can hold V for vertex snapping and snap to, say, the equator vertex right here to get it right in the center of the sphere. Now this is incorrect for this bell clapper. See? That's not what we want. But if we take a close look, I do have vertexes still on the very bottom of this bell clapper, the stem of it. And so that would probably be the place that I would prefer to set the pivot for. So I'm going to hit Insert one more time to change to this setting pivot mode. Hold down V for vertex snapping and then drag from the center. It must be from the center until my mouse overlaps that vertex. You can see that it will snap to all sorts of things. In fact, I think it just snapped, to the wrong spot. So you may have to rotate your camera into a position that has nothing else overlapping at that point. Hold down V, drag from the center. There we go. So now we rotate our camera around, we can see that it's rotating from the right place. And then we can hit one of our transformation tools. So W, E, or R. E is for rotate. And I'm going to rotate this to see, does the action line up with what I would like? And yeah, it basically does. Now, in actuality, I think I set the center of pivot for this a bit lower, somewhere down here, not directly on a vertex. But vertex snapping initially can help us to get generally the right location or an aligned location. And then we can worry about specifics after that. We can see there, that's all lined up. So over here on my example object, we could do the same thing. I don't really know where I'd like to snap this, but we'll just snap it to this corner vertex over here. And then if we really wanted to, we could hold down C, and I could drag it along an edge if I wanted to. There we go. So I could drag it along this edge to align. I could then switch to X for grid and have it snap to one of these grid points, but now it's still aligned with that edge. Whatever we want, really. Then I'm going to hit Insert to exit that mode, and I can rotate my entire assembly from this position. So that's all of our setup instructions for every one of these that doesn't have to do with hierarchy. So to run through that list one more time, it was delete the history first, freeze your transformations on your object, check that there are no extra objects or leaf level transforms, which is what we call those special objects in the outliner. And you can also look in the input section in the channel box to verify that. Set the center of pivot to an appropriate location by using the Insert key, and then name it. You should always name everything that you are setting up in your scene if it's going to remain separate. If you don't name things, it will get very confusing in the animation editor or in Unity if you import these things, and really you'll just be kicking yourself if you don't name all of your objects. Now keep in mind that if you're going to mesh combine things, do all of that before any of these steps, because you don't have to do any of this for those objects that are no longer going to exist. So in the case of this clock, all of these you can see were originally individual pieces such as the brick, the body of the clock, the trim, the roof tiles, and even the numbers on the clock surface. But now they're all mesh combined. So I didn't follow any of those instructions until I had this entire object modeled. Then we want to do those setup instructions so that we can have a nice clean hierarchy to do our next step with. Let's go ahead and set up our object with a demonstration of parenting and grouping. There's a difference between the two. You can find both of the options in Edit. At the bottom, we've got hierarchy, grouping and ungrouping, and also parenting and unparenting. And make note of the keyboard shortcuts for parent and unparent, because you do use them quite a bit, although I have a different way that I prefer to do it, which I will show in a moment. So what this is to make one object sort of move with, scale with, rotate with another object, but also retain its own ability to move. So a great example of this would be the door. I want my entire clock to be able to move and position and scale in my scene, but I also want this door to be able to rotate, open and close. So I want the door to be a child of the clock. So the way we do this is we select the child first, the parent second, and then we just hit the letter P. And that, if you take a look in the outliner, makes it so that the clock body has this little plus mark next to it. And when I click the clock body, the door is highlighted as well. You can see the difference where this other door is not highlighted. So now if I move the clock, that door is also moving, but I can click the door and it will still rotate and it will keep that position respective to its parent. If I zero out these transformations, then clock body goes back. If I zero out these transformations, door goes back. Okay, and if we open up this little plus mark, you can see here's the door, here is the clock body. Okay, if for some reason we decide that we don't want to keep that, then we want to select the child and use Shift P or unparent, and now you can see it's separate in the outliner again. So that's just these two commands, parent and unparent. So what is the difference between that and grouping? Okay, well, a group is sort of an invisible object that you can select in the outliner, but you can't select physically in the scene. So for this, let's use the toy man as an example. I may want one global selection point for the entire person to move them into and out of the clock and then animate all of their parts. I could just use the body for this and make everything a child of the body, but for some reason, let's say I want a different one. So I'll just select all of those objects and I want to deselect anything that is not a part of the toy. You may want to use wireframe mode to make sure that everything is selected, or take a look in the outliner. So then we're going to use group. So Control G and no shortcut for ungrouping, I guess. So group. So groups are interesting. You can see that it creates this, what looks like a leaf level transform. I suppose it is really, it's a transform group. And inside of it are all of these pieces, but there's no way for me to just select that in the view. It's invisible. It has no physical presence. What we can do is use the keyboard to navigate the hierarchy. If I hit the upward key, then I go up in the hierarchy. Okay. If I hit the down key, I go down in the hierarchy. And if you hit left or right, you step through all of the members in the hierarchy. So this is nice for navigating a hierarchy quickly. If you don't want to keep clicking all the time, or for skeletal structures, you can do this as well. So our group has its own center of pivot, which is over there right now. It has its own position, and all of the members are highlighted when you select the group. So I would have to treat this the same way that I treated my objects. I want to move my center of pivot, and in this case, let's snap it to the bottom vertex on our toy. Got to make sure that I've actually done that properly by zooming in. Take a look. Yep, that's in the right position. So I'm going to hit Insert to exit that tool. and then name it. So I will just name this toy man. So now I have an object which moves the entire toy man, but doesn't care about how many members there are and what structure they have. It just ignores all of that. So that could be a nice way to set up certain objects. You're going to have to make a choice of when you want to do that sort of thing. Personally, I try to avoid groups because I prefer to be able to click to select things, but they are a very valuable resource sometimes. Like if you had orbiting objects, so let's just very quickly make a few planets around nothing. So I'm just going to duplicate a few times. I'm using Control D, by the way, in case anybody's unfamiliar with that. And I'm going to just select this group of spheres. If I want to rotate them from the middle, or what looks like the middle, there is no object that does that, and I would have to pick one of them to move their pivot to the middle, which might be less than ideal if I wanted to also have them rotate. Okay, so I would grab all of them, and then I would group, and the center of pivot goes over there. Usually a good first step, even if you're going to custom set the center of pivot, is to do modify center pivot. Okay, so now that has placed it in the middle of the group as near as it could tell, and then I could adjust it a little bit to say maybe over here and decide, oh, that one is too far out, so I'm going to move him over. But here's the group. Okay, there are all the spheres, so they can all be animated independently, and now I can orbit the entire group of spheres around however I choose. I'm going to delete this, and notice that all of the children are deleted along with the group. Okay, so if you want to remove children from a group, you have to ungroup them. If you don't want to do that, then you can just delete the entire group. So I'm going to set this back to its original location, and then I'm going to ungroup all of the children. Okay, and it says you can't. Okay, I actually have to ungroup this. Edit, ungroup. There we go. So why didn't that work? Sort of we're in a hierarchy. Grouping is about groups only. It's not about objects. So if I say hat, ungroup, you can't do that. It's not a group. That command only works for groups. So if I want to get rid of this hat from this group, only the hat, it's actually parenting. I want to unparent. Okay, so group is not a different method. It just creates an empty object for you to mess around with. So now you can see the hat is separate and the rest of the toy man is inside of the group. If we unparented all of these objects, the group is still in our scene. It just doesn't have any members now. Okay, so be aware that there's a difference there between those two things. I'm going to go ahead and delete my empty group so that we can parent this properly. So now we're going to set up our clock, and we want to think about this in terms of function. What do we want to be able to animate? What do we want to logically happen when we click certain parts of this object? For instance, I think when I click the clock body, the entire thing should highlight and move. The chain, the pendulum, the toy man, everything. If I were to just click the hands of the clock, I want to only move that individual hand. I don't want to select both of them. I don't want to even set up something like when the hour hand moves, the minute hand moves so much. That's a more advanced setup for a different time, but we could set up individual relationships that way. So we look at our structure and we start to parent things together, and we can parent and reparent as much as we want. So it's easy to do this very quickly. I'm going to select everything. I'm going to deselect the clock body and then select it again. That's so that it's last. When you use a parent command, the last thing becomes the parent. So if I hit P, everything now is a part of the clock body object. Okay. I mentioned that there's another way to do this, and it is to middle mouse drag things inside of the structure. So for that example, I'm going to grab the arm. So here's arm right, and here's the toy body. I want the arm to be attached to the toy body. So I'm going to middle mouse drag it onto toy body, and now we can see it is a child. We also want the left arm to be a part of the toy body. We want the head to be a part of the toy body. Where's the head? There's the toy body. Okay, those are the first things that would be parented, but then subsequent parts like this hand I don't want that hand to be a part of the toy body. I want it to be a part of the arm. And so I have to make sure I get the correct arm. That is the right arm. There we go. And which hand? Not that hand, this hand. Okay. So I'm going to drag that onto the arm. Oops, I did it wrong. See that? I just open up the structure and I'll just middle mouse drag it to the other arm. You can see how this can be confusing. I actually only named it hand, and hand 1 just happened because I duplicated it. I didn't put an R or an L on it. Notice that the naming structure that I've used, arm R, as it is right arm, is probably something I should have done here. So I'm just going to really quickly rename that with an R so I don't get confused anymore. And the other hand, even though this will be a part of the structure from now on, now I've got a left hand and a right hand, and I don't have to worry anymore about which is which. Okay. I want the bell to also be a part of that left hand. Okay, so now I can move. Oh, I'm doing it wrong again. Geez, I'm getting really confused. Here we go, right hand. I want that bell to be a part of that right hand. I don't know why I've left that separate. I can wiggle it like this. It almost looks like he's bending his wrist, but then I also have access to the hand at the same time, which the pivot I put down the sleeve a little bit. That's probably unnecessary, but I'm just going to leave it as is. What I do need is the clapper for that bell. Here we go. And so now we've got this long hierarchy. If I close the toy body, we can't see any of those children until we reopen. I'm just going to close each one of these one by one to make it annoying. Because here's what happens when you do that sort of thing. My hierarchy is closed in the outliner. And if I click the plus, it will only open the first level of objects typically. Then if I click the next plus, it'll open the next level of objects, and so on and so on. That's good if you've got a complex hierarchy that you don't want to see every single object, but it's annoying if you're trying to see all of those objects at once to verify. So here's what you can do. If you close the top level object, then hold down Shift and click that plus, it will open the entire hierarchy all at once. Everything will be exposed. This may cause a big scroll, so you'll have to scroll down to see whatever you're looking for, but it can be a big time saver if you want to see everything in your hierarchy. So let's see, our toy body has right now arms, bell, clapper, but he's missing his hat. Okay, and I did that to check. Sometimes it's quicker to just select your parent object and rotate it or move it to see what gets left behind, especially if you have small things like maybe these buttons might get left behind. It's a good way to visually check. You can also just check inside of your outliner to see what highlights. But we need his hat to be a part of his body. Now, if I just put this as a part of body, clock body, toy body, here we go, that means it will move. Okay, but when I move his head, the hat doesn't go with. So we want to make sure that all of this makes logical sense. What I'm doing right now as I'm parenting these things is kind of doing a function check, just to see, is it logical? Does it work properly? Is everything rotating from the correct spot? Is it named right? There are a lot of checks involved in rigging and setting up objects, and you want to do them as soon as possible and get everything right before you run the risk of making an error that undoes a lot of your work. So I'm going to parent that to the head so we can check that that goes along with. We didn't need to do the nose or the facial features, by the way, because that was all mesh combined. I'm never going to animate any of that, and so all of that is just a part of that structure already. We've got the entire body of the little toy man. Let's check all of the pivot points. The rotation of the head is down in the neck area, so you can look around and bend his head forward and backward. His hat, if I care about it, right now it doesn't do anything useful. I could sort of rotate and move it. It would make a lot more sense if this was rotating from the center of this ball down here. So I'm going to hit Insert, and there's no vertex for me to snap in the middle of this ball, but it was formerly a sphere. So I can do a sort of sneaky method of getting the exact center. I'm going to snap it to that vertex, which is one of the poles of the original sphere. Then I'm going to come down to the side, and so long as I have an equator band of edges, then I can hold down V and only move the vertical direction until I hover my mouse over one of those vertexes on the equator and let go. And now this should be right in the center of his head. So that was a little hard to tell what was going on. Let me just select this. This row here is right in the middle, halfway between top and bottom. And I snapped vertically, but I overlapped my mouse on this vertex. It's important for you to overlap your mouse, otherwise this doesn't work properly. So now if I rotate my hat, it sort of sticks to his head no matter where I put it, which is probably a bit more convenient for the kind of animation I might end up doing. Okay. His body right now rotating not quite from the bottom, but somewhere in his lower legs. I actually think that's fine because he's going to have his feet back here. I don't really want it at the very bottom. His arms are rotating from the shoulder area, like that. I did set up most of these previously. You may note that there are some transforms here that I'm not zeroing. These right here, this -18. Here's the reason why. Take a look at my rotation controller. Right now, because I've got that small rotation outside, this ring is lined up along the side of the body, kind of going at a diagonal angle. And I can rotate it up and down like that very easily. If I freeze this, well, now it rotates like this along one channel only. And that's fine, but it's kind of inconvenient. It makes it go inside of his body a little bit, and I would have to sort of rotate freely out at this angle, and now my rotation channels are all messed up. If I do something like this, then it's a lot cleaner to animate this. And I think, yeah, it doesn't actually work, but if I try to just rotate the Z channel only, it is still leaned over like that. So I'd have to do some additional setup if I really wanted to make this a single channel rotation. But for this setup video, I don't think we're going to be too concerned about that. Just know that you can choose to leave certain channels rotated or moved if you have a good reason like this. Okay. The wrist right now rotating from up the sleeve and pretty significantly. Just note that my modeling doesn't actually go that far. I just chose to rotate it from over here. It would make sense to go all the way back to the elbow, but I just didn't want to bother because it's not really going to move very much. So I just moved it back the sleeve just a little bit. This one actually does have non-zeroed rotations. I'm not sure if I want to keep those or not. Oh, I see. I was trying to stand the bell sort of upright just for a starting position. That's fine. I am actually going to freeze those though. So I'm going to freeze transformations. Now this is considered 0 for this object. Although the rotation didn't lean over because of this. So this object is determining what the vertical position for this rotator is. You can actually change the way that your transformation tools work by holding down the transformation tool key. So in case of rotation, it's E, and then holding down left click, and you can change it to be relative to the world. So now this is absolute in terms of world value, or you can change it to object, which is what rotation is typically centered on. And you've got a bunch of other objects that are options there as well. You can do this with the translate key, same way. Hold down W, hold down left click, and you get a radial menu for options. And scale, hold down R, hold down left click. Be careful not to leave this in a mode that you don't prefer. The defaults for them are object for rotation and scale, and world for translate. But knowing that that exists can sometimes be a big help. Anyway, going back to our object, so our bell is sort of leaned over like that. This is not exactly convenient, but I think it's fine. I'm not actually going to rotate the bell in the hand. I'm just going to use the hand. So I won't worry about that. All of the transformations are zeroed. And then previously we had messed with our clapper. And so all I need to do is be able to rotate it back and forth. It is still kind of aligned with the shoulder, but I'm not going to be too concerned about that because I will probably just be rotating a single channel. How you would fix this problem with the bell rotating at the wrong angle is that you would have to unparent this clapper. So I'm going to hit Shift P, unparent this clapper, and you can see that my rotations have changed to reflect the rotation of this shoulder. That will happen sometimes. It tries to keep the relative position of objects in your scene when you parent or unparent, which is why we get leaf level transforms and things like this happen where it puts in some values for you in the channel box. It's trying to reflect the reality that this thing was rotated over with the shoulder. So now I'm going to freeze the transformations in this object all by itself. Oh, I actually have an option set previously. If you go into the option box for freeze transformations, you have the option to set what you are freezing. The defaults, let me just reset, are only translate, rotate, and scale, but not joint orient. That has to do with bones. Later on, we'll explore that. I'm going to hit apply and now close this. And so the defaults are restored and I don't have to go into the option box. So this clapper now is rotating what appears to be straight across. And I'm going to reparent it to the bell to show you what happens here. So here we've got the bell rotated over just like the arm. Don't really worry about that. Okay. And if I select the clapper is now oriented correctly. But if you look in the channel box, there's all sorts of new numbers in there. Okay. So if we wanted to get rid of those numbers and set this as the 0 point, well, we can't. This has to counter rotate against this shoulder so that it can be upright like this. And unfortunately, all of our channels are still going to be messed up, but we could leave it like this in order to have the clapper moving straight across. But these translates are a little bit concerning as well. I'm not actually going to animate that, but I just wanted to show that you can go into Modify Freeze Transformations option box and just choose translates. So now we can freeze the translates. There they go. And then close this. And our rotation is set properly. Our bell still works properly. Our arm is still oriented properly, but we don't have the messy transforms that we didn't want. So that's just an example of how you might fix that if you really wanted to. Again, not necessary for this setup. And there are better ways, such as using groups or actually using bones and orienting them properly. In the fullness of time, we'll explore that. But just for now, in case you have that sort of problem, then that's how you would handle it. And so that should be our arms setup. Actually, that's our entire toy man setup. Yeah, he's all set. So those were everything that we needed to do to get him ready for animation that isn't a part of a different future lecture, such as hiding channels, locking channels, setting up more complex relationships, that sort of thing. So we could close the toy body and move on to the rest of the object. At this point, it's important for me to note that the more complex your scene setup, the more likely it is you should be saving often and saving iteratively. This is an example file that I've separated from my own working files, but normally there would be some sort of number at the end of my save file, 1, 2, 3, etc. as you go to set up, and maybe even stages such as modeling, rigging, skinning. If you go all the way through a complex setup like we did with the toy, you should probably at least click the save button or have autosave enabled. You may even want to iterate the number so that you have a version to go back to save your progress. At this stage, it seems a little bit silly to go through all that fuss, but it's not going to be silly for long. The more complex your scene, the more critical it is that you do something like that. So have caution. Let's check the rest of these objects really quick. The two doors are simple enough. They just rotate from the respective hinges, which I snapped to the vertex at the center of these cylinders here to make it extra convenient, and then checked that they didn't intersect anything when I rotate them. So that's all set up properly. We've got the pendulum. Pendulum is rotating from basically its contact point at the bottom of the clock. I actually think that should probably be just a little bit higher, something like up here, because the mechanism would be inside of that clock body. And then I'm just checking that it's not hitting anything else that's hanging down there, and that we have zeroed rotations. The two weights aren't actually going to do anything. They're still separate just because it made sense to separate them, but they don't have any function, so they can just be a part of this structure, and I don't have to worry about that. So there we go. That should be everything that we needed to position our clock in our scene wherever we want to go. Actually, the rotation for the clock itself I didn't set. I suppose if you were going to put this on a wall, it would make sense to snap the center of pivot to the back face of this clock. It doesn't have to be anywhere in particular, but being on the back face of this clock means that we could use this to position it on a flat wall wherever it is, and that would be extra convenient. Oh, the hands. I didn't actually look at them, but they were kind of set up already because I put the center of pivot right in the middle. Just want to verify that they can rotate, they're not hitting any of the numbers or the opposite hand, and that both of them are frozen. Okay. So that should be about everything that we needed to set up this character, and it's pretty much ready for animation at this point. So we would double check that everything was frozen really quick by maybe going through the hierarchy. We could use the arrow keys for this. So if I hit left and right, we can check for siblings. There are no siblings, except we do have invisible cameras in this scene, so they're considered siblings. I mean, hit the down arrow key to check toy body and door, hand. And as I'm clicking through these, I can see there was one, this one right here, door R, that had a -1 on its scale value. So that was easy to go through very quickly. Remember, I don't want to just freeze everything. And there's a chance that if I freeze clock body at this point, modify freeze transformations, it's going to freeze every child, but I didn't want to freeze the arms. Okay, so you do have to do this before you do the hierarchy step, which is why we went through all that fuss. If you do have to freeze something that is already a part of a hierarchy like this door, as long as it is the lowest child, you can just go right ahead and do it. But you should never freeze parents if you have children that you don't want to freeze. So now those arms are back because I hit undo back before the moment when I had hit freeze transformations and everything. That's why I'm going through the hierarchy like this. So just to check, I'm clicking through, keeping my eyes on the channel box over there. Nothing is moving, so we're all good. I'm going to hit down in the hierarchy and look at siblings. Here's an arm. They have rotations, but I wanted to keep them. We already went through and checked the arms in detail, so we can pretty much just go back up to the toy body, and we're all set. Everything has been double checked, and we would want to save at this point. Okay. It is very important, just as a final note, to save your rig files or your setup files before animation occurs, and to save a new version when animation starts. Because if there's a problem with the way that you've set up your scene, this is your last chance to fix it before animation gets very complex and messy and potentially dirties everything up such that you have to redo a ton of work. So very last thing, save this file, make sure that you know that it's your final setup file, the one that you should start animating on.